Let's say a show was made with the best Gotham, the most fleshed out a villain could ever possibly be, all set in a Batman universe that rivals, or in my opinion, is better than the Nolan trilogy. That is the Penguin to a fault, and barring a massive exception, is the greatest comic book show ever. The argument could be made for one of the best comic book projects ever, and I wouldn't be opposed. This may be a bit different from my usual viewers used to my cyberpunk stuff, but this show was entirely way too good for me to not talk about. So, spoiler warning for the whole show during this video, and please do yourself the favor and watch it whenever you can. And before I continue, this is your heads up that I may be doing things a bit differently this video. Because of how much this show actually has to discuss, I found it very difficult to actually decide on where to start. Eventually, I decided on speaking on what actually defines a good comic book show or show in general, and that's always going to be in the writing. Is what the character's saying actually believable within the context of the world we're observing? Gotham, and specifically the Gotham we're introduced to in the Batman, feels exactly like the Gotham we come to live in during the Penguin. Without skipping a beat, I felt like I was immediately slipping on the glove we had been given during the Batman. Of course, an overwhelming majority of this comes from the fact that the cinematography of the show is very similar to the movie. That in and of itself puts the show leagues ahead of its contemporaries. However, we get to experience Gotham as a character just as we did Bruce. We get to live in the underbelly instead of looking down on it in black and white from the perspective of an unseasoned vigilante. But most importantly, we get to experience Gotham from a monster trying to rule it. Because ultimately, we know what Oz is. He's a monster who will, and has, screwed over every person he's ever seen as a friend or an ally. His personality and intentions are littered throughout the show, long before we ever reach the finale. Specifically, there's a scene where Oz lectures and gaslights Vic on him being too good for the life that they live.
A good criminal, you know?
Yeah.
And so I wasn't surprised that he didn't let him go, but I would have loved if he did let him go, especially with how things turned out.
Yeah, no, one thing that I definitely thought about was the fact that you sort of expect that it's a fucking show about the Penguin, like a Batman, one of Batman's villains. You sort of expect the lying and the gaslighting, but one thing that, you know, was sort of surprising is that it felt like they were starting to develop a real relationship, even though it was still early in the show. One of the things he said was, "Is this all you feel? Like you could have left whenever you wanted." Like that's very obviously not the case. Like is that, bro? It was very obviously not the case. He tried to kill him when he initially left, or when he initially tried to leave when he was burying Alberto, or when he was putting Alberto in the trunk. And this is just one example. Not to mention there's the countless times Oz flat out lies to Sofia to get on her good side. Of course, we have the glaring lie of Oz putting Alberto's death on the Maronis, but there's also the little white lies that he tells Sofia. It comes in the form of the scene during the funeral where Oz tells Sofia about his mother's mourning of his brothers.
At the start of the show, when he's telling Vic how he lost his brother to the city, he said the same thing to Sofia in a different way. I feel like we always know is more to the story. Even though they try to pin him as a good character, there's no point where we believe that that's all to the story.
Yeah, that is true. Like you very quickly get the sense that there's a lot more going on than Oz is letting on, and I do like that. Like every time that Oz talks, it feels like such a lie. But it's so interesting because even in the Batman movie, remember when Batman and Gordon were talking to him? And he was like, "No, I'm not the rat, blah, blah, blah." He seemed like that same passion he was showing whenever he was lying in the show. Here's the thing about lying. The best way to lie is to tell an alternate version of the truth. That is technically what Oz tells Sofia. It's what he does the entire show. It's also what makes the show's writing so good because there's so many expectations being subverted that we don't know what the truth is until we're actually shown it. It helps build this suspense and feels like this ominous cloud hanging over the entire show during its runtime. As an example, let's look back at Oz's conversation with Sofia at Alberto's funeral. By this point, it's an established fact that Oz's mother has some form of dementia and is slowly losing her mind. It's a sad sight to see, so automatically we're empathetic to her situation and, more importantly, Oz's. He goes on and explains what happened after the death of his brothers. That his mother was basically bedridden and isolated and wanting nothing to do with anyone until one day, she seemingly snapped out of it and took Oz dancing. A few things happened during this scene in particular. Sofia, previously viewing Oz as an enemy, now loosens her guard around him on account of them having seemingly mutual trauma to understand together, but not bond, and that's very important. She's understanding but doesn't want to be betrayed again, rightfully so given what we eventually learn later. Then, as the audience, we are even more enveloped in sympathy for Oz as he tells this story. This is because we've already seen how Oz's mother is, so we can be quick to infer that this was the moment she began to lose it. No one just feels better from grief one day. People may learn to live with it, but when you recall on someone's memory after they've passed, it does hurt to some degree because they're not there anymore. Oz plays on Sofia's obvious sympathy in this moment, reflecting on the times as if he wasn't the direct cause of his brother's deaths. Getting to see the story unfold in the actual show with all of the added context is probably one of the best possible creative moves I've seen, just because of what it adds to the scene at the funeral. We learned that his mother had just had a conversation with Rex about killing him, and her getting ready could have been a relief for her because of what was meant to come. Of course, Oz himself never knew about this, so seeing him tell a story he already left important details out of, only for us to discover there's even more to that, is basically a masterclass in writing. Then we have Oz's relationship with Vic. It's so interesting seeing this power dynamic between the two, especially because of what we might get in the future between this Batman and a possible Robin. It starts off as one would expect, but surprisingly doesn't end how one would expect. The story very easily establishes Oz as the villain he is, and evidently doesn't shy away from that. However, we're endeared to this relationship because of why Oz takes Vic in. He very clearly means to kill Vic at the beginning, but then decides against it, seeing himself in Vic. More specifically, seeing the physical issue that the two share. Oz seeing Vic with his stutter very quickly made him at the very least empathetic to Victor. Even when he meant to kill him, Oz heard Victor out. He took a chance on Victor despite us already seeing how ruthless he can be. The concern Oz has for Victor becomes even more apparent in the episode of the gaslighting I discussed earlier. Before the two are ever in the club, they're at lunch gathering information for the meet during the club. However, the two have a bit of a heart-to-heart. After a waiter said the food Vic wanted before he could get the words out, Oz quickly snapped on the waiter, later telling Vic to not care about the time of others, to make them wait to hear what you have to say and to take up all the space that you possibly can. It's everything someone like Victor wants to hear from a father figure, and it's something he probably hadn't heard before ever. This is where I believe the audience was truly on the hook for anything Oz was about to do going forward, until the end that is. But before we get there, I'd love to just look at Sofia as a character, and more specifically her relationship with Oz. She's painted as the antagonist in the show and will probably be one going forward in this universe, but I've never seen a better example of someone being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Carmine Falcone, her father of course, is an evil in his own right that I won't get into, but sacrificing his own daughter to save his ass when he didn't have to absolutely played into Sofia breaking. Even if it was apparent that these women were disappearing from Carmine's club, there was no shred of actual proof that he had anything to do with it. And Sofia finally expressing the bottled up anger for a decade and liberating herself from everything to do with her family was euphoric to see. Knowing each one of them had a hand in what happened and getting their comeuppance was absolutely perfect. And as for the relationship between her and Oz, I think it's almost as good as his relationship with Vic. I've already talked about the funeral, but another few scenes in the show I want to touch on are the flashbacks and the turning point of their relationship. We see during the flashbacks of Sofia's story that she was pretty much the only one that showed Oz any real respect. We get her defending Oz from Alberto's insults.
Hey, Penguin up there is gonna have to clean this up.
Don't call him that.
And just generally treating him like a normal person. However, I do like that they show flaws in Sofia as a person. Even if in the end we're rooting for her, this flashback has multiple examples that she isn't perfect. First, Oz tries to warn her against talking to the press even if she didn't actually reveal anything.
Look, Sofia, meeting a reporter, people are gonna start to get ideas. Your father might not like...
Stop! Stop talking. I don't need your advice. I don't care what you think. No one does. You are my driver. That is all you are. So stop talking and drive.
And at first, this can be attributed to just anger in the moment. We get so caught up sometimes that we just want to be as hurtful as we can to the person closest to us in the moment. However, there's a line later on that, while I love Sofia, really left a bad taste in my mouth, and probably most other people. And the issue with this is very simple. She treats Oz as if he's a dog, a nuisance that doesn't belong in the house with the other people. What's even crazier is that she absolutely understands what it means to be kind to Oz as seen earlier and still chose to say this. One massive thing about the Batman that I love so much is that while we've gotten so many early career Batman stories, very few focus on Bruce's worldview, meaning they never show how black and white the world seems to be for him. In the case of the Penguin as a show, we're shown on so many occasions, much like the lesson Bruce learns, not everything is black and white. Had Bruce been more aware of the ongoings of the show without learning the lesson he did at the end of his movie, he would have put Sofia back in Arkham, no questions asked, almost a more cruel version than what happened. We're also shown multiple times that Oz isn't a good man, but with the reason we're given, we want him to win. Colin Farrell's performance is so endearing that we find a monster charismatic pretty much until the end, along with his motivation. The guy just wants his mother's love, and it's here that the story truly shines. I'm sure we've all been desperate to have someone's love, but to this degree is almost sickening. His entire reason for being is to please his mother, and even on what seemed to be her deathbed, he made it about him. He reached out and didn't apologize or tell her he loved her, but screamed in agony for her love and pride for what he had done. For the sake of going through these moments in order, let's continue to the scene right after, probably the most heartbreaking one in the show. Personally, one of my favorite shots in the show is Vic and Oz reflecting on their journey on that bench in the finale. It's gorgeous looking at Gotham, and given that the show had a fraction of the budget of the movie, achieving that look from the movie is amazing, and I will always sing his praises. Greg Fraser is the fucking man. As for the heartbreaking scene, Victor seems to have genuine admiration for Oz by this point. Everything he set out to do, he's done. While a bit twisted, he respects Oz's love for his mother. He sees Oz as a man that has ambitious goals and is able to actually achieve them, unlike most people, despite the overwhelming odds that the two face during the show. He sees Oz as a man to look up to despite his occasional shortcomings. He's provided Vic with money, confidence, reassurance, and most of all, protection during the most vulnerable time of his life. Then, Vic calls him family. Now I gotta admit, this was a genuine suspicion of mine that Vic would be dead by the end of the season. It was during his flashback episode that I got the idea, but truthfully, I thought it would be Sofia or even Sal that would kill him, given how he was always with Oz and they would see him as a vulnerability to Oz. Even then, if Oz were to kill him, I at least thought he would do it with dignity and shoot him to make it fast. Before I get to Vic's death, let's back up to the family line. Now, I love the framing of this entire line of dialogue. We knew going into the finale there was a certain level of significance for Oz when it came to family. He very much cared for his mother, even if it was in his own twisted way. Then, there's another scene I want to discuss in particular between Oz and Sofia. I won't be retreading their relationship too much, but after the deal that Oz and Sofia make with the Triad, they have a real heart-to-heart, and it's exactly as I said earlier. Every lie has a shred of truth to it. Despite knowing what Oz's plan is and how he intends to achieve his goal, we all feel a sense of genuine pride for himself coming from him in this scene, considering where he is and where he came from. Not only that, there's a legitimate sorrow coming from him, and this fact is later pointed out by the way he reacts to Sofia being taken away to Arkham. That's why it's so hard to gauge whether or not Oz is ever being genuine, and it's what causes such a shock when Vic has his line about Oz being family. There's this insane tension in the air because ultimately we don't know what Oz is going to do at this point. We see very clearly what he's done for and to family, so there's this genuine suspenseful scene that's played out beautifully because while we do second guess what Oz will do in response to what Vic said, we know deep down who this man is. Seeing him strangle Vic was very much the stepping stone he needed to take to become the Penguin as we know him, but it was still devastating to witness. Now, by this point, I'm sure you're asking yourself what exactly this has to do with making a good comic book show. First off, we have the absolutely impeccable writing. I've discussed this at length and will some more, but the writing has to be the focal point because of the source material that you're dealing with in a comic book show. We're already in a fantastical world that most people go into finding it hard to truly believe in, which is why there needs to be a tie between the audience and the sometimes absurd nature of the comic book genre. The writing not only helps bridge that gap of understanding and belief, but also elevates the expectation of what this genre can be. Second, there needs to be a level of faithfulness to the source while also allowing yourself with enough creative freedom so that you're not just copy and pasting, but making an actual adaptation. A one-of-one copy can exist of these characters, but the point of this genre is creativity, and what better way to express that than to change certain aspects of the character. In this case, Oz can come across as a Tony Soprano ripoff, but Tony's a great character, so fuck it. As for the comic book part of this character, his relationship with his mother is very similar to the comics. Of course, the show takes it even further, but that's the whole point of Reeves' vision for this Batman universe. I also want to focus on the finale because there's something important I want to say regarding modern day villains. After he seemingly kills his only weakness, Oz returns to his penthouse with two honestly disgusting revelations. Earlier in the show, Oz's mother asked him to put her out of her misery should she become a vegetable, and he denied her that privilege because he didn't get to hear her say she's proud of him. That is a level of selfishness you could only get from a Gotham villain, but then we get the not so Freudian slip of the fucking century. Oz dresses up his lady friend throughout the show, Eve, as his mother when they had their dance earlier in his childhood, which is also referenced in the show. I won't dive into the idea of an Oedipus complex because this is not the time nor the place, but as for what modern villains have become, I'm not at all happy with it. It feels now as if all villains have this sense of genuine justice, and they were either dealt a bad hand or went about achieving justice in their own wrong way. In other words, every villain in some way or another isn't always wrong. And while it can be compelling for a villain, in other words, now almost all villains aren't really wrong. Even the Riddler in this very universe. He is absolutely a sociopath, but his desire to expose corruption and restore power to at least some degree to the people of Gotham was noble. Of course, the whole point of his character is that he's too psychotic to realize it's insane to try and literally cleanse the city of the poor when he was once in their position, a victim of corruption. To some degree, he still is. However, I do enjoy this show mainly for the reason that Oz doesn't have some sad reason he broke bad. He's been evil since he was a child, honestly, and he remained that way through the entirety of his life. He will lie and kill and do whatever he must to achieve what he desires, and I love this from a villain. Someone who is evil for their own selfish reasons, and that's it. Nothing more, nothing less. There's no issue with the villain being right, but it's almost overdone at this point. Truthfully, if Oz is this bad, I can only imagine what Matt Reeves has planned for the Joker. And before I end this video, while Reeves was the executive producer and oversaw production of the entire show, Lauren LaFranc is to thank for this masterpiece, so I'm just making sure she gets her due as a showrunner and writer. I honestly cannot wait to see more from this universe, and I'm curious to hear from you guys. Do you believe Vic would still be alive if he didn't call Oz family, or was he doomed from the start? Something to think on, but take care of yourself and one another. Peace.